Everybody, and welcome to Talks with Tweed. Both you all here who showed up on this rainy day and our online audience who are here. So I'm delighted to have you. So let's see where we go. This is the next episode. I am doing these roughly every month, and we do several things, anything about the presidency. So sometimes we have a descendant. We've done several descendants, and the purpose of those are to let the descendant tell you what he or she thinks his ancestor is misremembered for. There's historians get right, historians get wrong, what they would prefer. So that's quite interesting. And then we have historians, and we have one today, and I'll go into that in a minute, who come write various aspects. We generally, as that echo gone,
No feedback there.
we generally don't do, and we get the feedback on it. We generally don't do biographies in our operations. This is sponsored by two groups, the Roosevelt School at Long Island University and the Society of Presidential Descendants. And the Society of Presidential Descendants, I created 4 years ago with another bunch of other descendants, when we discovered there was no organization for president, well, believe it or not, no organization for descendants. So we do several things. One thing we do is we go to different presidential sites every year, and that's fun. But we also have two sort of purposes. One is civics education. One of the problems we think in this country is we are not teaching people how to be good citizens. And the result is we have now maybe two generations out there that have no idea what their duty is and responsibilities as citizens. They all know what they are owed and their rights, but most of them don't have any idea. So we need to do that. A lot of people realize this is a problem. So another thing we do is support the study of the presidency. And we have an annual book award for the best book on presidential leadership. And so, and in fact, you know about that.
I do.
Any case.
With great gratitude.
He is one of our winners. So today we have a very interesting day, I think. We have Harold Holzer here, who has an extraordinarily varied career as a practitioner with politicians in various roles, including, I didn't realize, you just told me about Bella Abzug. Remember Bella Abzug? Quite a lady. I would have loved to have known her. Was she any hard to work with?
Oh, no. She was
Anyway.
tough, but a good trainer of people.
Good trainer. Well, you're well trained then. So you're currently the director of the Roosevelt House of Public Policy at Hunter College, another Roosevelt House, so we have two of them. And he is, among a great many other things, authors of books. And I'm told he has written 55 books, is that correct?
Written or edited. Yeah.
Written or edited, okay. I tell him he's just gotten a little bit ahead of TR. TR wrote 50 books. He bragged in something in one of his things I saw there that he said 650 articles. TR had about 10,000, mostly things. So he's got some catching up. He's beat him in the book area, but he hasn't beat him in the other areas so well.
And I'm sure he's ahead in sales.
He's definitely ahead in sales. But if the contest is still going on, he's not here anymore, and you are. And his disadvantage was, of course, he had a busy other job.
He did have that
job
other
too.
job, yeah.
But anyway, enough of that. Let's get on to what we're going to talk about today. He's written mostly on Abraham Lincoln, and that's a very crowded field. There are about 16,000 books. That's a good number, I think. 16,000 books on Abraham Lincoln. I have a theory. My little library has like I think every library has a new bookshelf there. This library's been around since the Civil War. I don't think there's been a single time when they haven't had at least one book on Lincoln.
One new book.
Yeah,
I think you're right.
It's there all the time. It's really extraordinary. So it's quite brave of you to try to fuck all that. His most recent book, he writes about Lincoln and areas that generally people don't know about. So his most recent one, which is well worth reading, is Lincoln and immigration. Fascinating subject. I had never thought of Lincoln as, but it's very interesting. I recommend it. But the book we're going to talk about today, which is very relevant to where we are, is Presidents versus BS, the press. And that's certainly a very relevant thing to what we're doing. And his book is fascinating. I learned a great deal. I had no idea of the complexity of the different kinds of relationships there are. And every president has handled this differently. And I think what we'll do today is more or less chronologically go through the various people that are important in this particular subject and get some idea of the different kind of angles you can come from on it. There are all sorts of issues. But I thought we'd just start off. Why did you write it?
I mean, both books were kind of inspired by the politics of 2014, 2015, when we heard so much from candidate Donald Trump about immigrants and journalists, right? It was all through the campaign. So I actually signed on to do an immigration book, and then I saw all of the antagonism toward the press to a degree I'd never seen. So I flipped the order of the books and I went and did the press book first. But you know, I worked a little bit as a journalist at a very modest scale. When I graduated from college, I worked on a weekly newspaper that was so unsuccessful that the entire staff fell away and I became the editor. And my fiance, to whom I've been married for 55 years, became the associate editor and advertising manager. And we had a great time. And so I had a little bit of a journalistic background, and I was also a press secretary for Bella, as you say, and for Mario Cuomo when he was running for mayor of New York, and then in a certain part of his administration when he was governor. So that has made me particularly interested in the press all these years.
Well, it's certainly very valuable right now.
Yeah.
Why don't we go all the way back to the beginning
Okay.
and talk about the relationship between George Washington and the press?
Well, originally the press idolized George Washington along with every other American. You know, he's the only candidate who ever got all the electoral votes in an election. But Thomas Jefferson, his Secretary of State, wasn't too happy that nobody criticized his boss. So he convinced a Democratic anti-federalist journalist to relocate from New York to the capital of the country, Philadelphia. And lo and behold, there was a newspaper who suddenly started criticizing George Washington for, you know, his tendency to favor England over France in foreign relations. The next thing you know, Washington is denouncing false news. That's where that phrase began. Someone said, where did that first happen? I say, with the first president, you know, and ever since. And there was a report that he once took a newspaper at a cabinet meeting, threw it to the floor, and ground it with his boot. And I think he did not run for a third term, not only because he didn't want to establish a monarchical tradition, but because he didn't like being criticized. And by the middle of his second term, he was being lambasted by the Democratic newspapers.
It's quite something to start all the way back.
Yeah.
Because of course the public wasn't lambasting.
No, but the Democrats were souring on it. It's, you know, second half of your second term itis.
So along comes John Adams.
Right. And Adams is the one who gets Congress to enact the Alien and Sedition Act. The Sedition Act is applicable to the press because it made it a federal crime to make fun of or criticize the president of the United States. I think we're back to that. And against, you know, ask Stephen Colbert. It's against the law to criticize the president. But Washington, by the way, said, I would have gone even further than this act. So he was all in the Sedition Act. And so for 4 years, journalists were put in jail who criticized the administration. And who adjudicated it? The cases were adjudicated by federal judges who had all, at that point, been appointed by Federalists. So they were all Federalists, and they were all cracking down on dissent against the reigning party.
And how did it work, do you think, trying to prevent the press from?
It made the opposition press angrier. And when male editors would go into prison, I know of at least 3 instances where the wives became the editors and carried on the tradition.
Did any of them get in prison?
No, no,
They wouldn't.
that was a bridge too far for
Yeah.
the gentlemen of
Did
Federalists.
Did Adams have any comment to that strategy?
Oh, he was angry all the time. We know,
Yeah, he's an angry guy.
we've seen the miniseries, or 2 of the miniseries if you're as old as I. So yes, he was crabby, but he thought it was perfectly justified. He thought that the president should be above criticism. And Jefferson, the next fellow, believed in criticism until he was criticized. So he let the Sedition Act sunset. It didn't have to be, it was a 4-year bill, which ended of its own. And then, well, classic example, there was an editor named James Callender in Richmond, a pro-Jefferson editor. And this is the period when editors were also getting federal jobs to reward their loyalty. Callender was a big Jefferson supporter. And he said after Jefferson won, I would like to be the postmaster of Richmond. Now, this was not a really big deal. It's what he probably deserved in the tradition of the time. Jefferson said, I don't think he's suited. You know, they say he drinks, he's a reprobate, tell him no. Well, Callender then published for the first time the story of Jefferson's entanglement with the enslaved woman Sally Hemings, and revealed that he had children with an enslaved woman of color. And it has, you know, deservedly been part of his reputation ever since. He probably could have avoided it, or at least avoided it for a while longer, if he had done what most presidents do, which is reward journalists.
Mm-hmm.
And in his last days, he said, the only thing that's worth reading in a newspaper is the advertisements.
Well, he famously said, it's an evil with no remedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's unpack that. Is it an evil?
It's
Is there a remedy?
a necessary evil, and there shouldn't be a remedy, in my view.
Mm-hmm.
All of us get annoyed at newspaper editorials and op-eds and coverage and perceived biases, but I'm worried that where once we had a society where the largest newspapers were read by all of our neighbors and friends and family, and we discussed them and we argued about them, that now, especially young people, are reading these very small circulation websites and podcasts and developing their own anger, which they don't share with anybody because nobody else is in the common wheel with them. I think that's much more dangerous than having big newspapers come after you and getting the opportunity to push back.
And we'll get to the issue of how the delivery of news has changed, or the media, whatever you want to call it, and how each president used it differently. Back then, as you say, there were basically a few items, a few papers that took either.
And they were all weekly papers, and people thought, isn't it amazing that a paper can come out each week? You know, hand presses, printing these newspapers.
Very different. So now we go to Jackson. That was a whole new kind of relationship.
Jackson brought in pro-democratic editors from different parts of the country and installed them in the White House, made one of them postmaster general, made another one kind of his top assistant in the White House, and then established what was called a kitchen cabinet, mostly filled with newspapermen. And the other thing Jackson did is he awarded the lucrative contract to print the minutes of the Congress. There was no congressional record until 1860, to Lincoln. And Lincoln was disappointed because he couldn't appoint a newspaperman to do it. So he appointed the friendliest and most powerful newspaper to get the lucrative contract to print the congressional proceedings. And they owed him even more as a result.
Didn't solve the problem, though, did it?
No, because in fact, one of the great illustrated newspaper attacks on Jackson is outside of the room we're gathered in, the picture of a cartoon of a coffin to represent each of the people that Andrew Jackson had killed, either in war or in duels. And that was considered quite an attack on the president at the time.
How many was it?
I don't remember, but it's right. We can
We'll
count.
go look.
Yeah.
Okay. We move forward now to Lincoln. We begin to get into the issue of changing opportunities of a different kind of media he could use against the press.
Right. Well, Lincoln, was like everyone after Jackson. He was dependent on the press that supported him, the Republican press, and he was hostile to the Democratic press. And by the way, Lincoln, in the year before his election, purchased a German language Republican newspaper, and which he basically got out of hock and gave to a German-speaking editor with a proviso that it say nothing contrary to Republican doctrine for a year and some months, after which the printing press would belong to the editor. And Lincoln didn't care about, he contributed $500, which was, $25,000 today or more. And so he was a publisher, for our first publisher president. And but what Lincoln did that changed the face of relationships between the presidents and the press is, during the Civil War, he decided that freedom of the press was not a necessary guarantee in this country. And as a result, newspapers were closed down. Newspaper men were imprisoned in New York, in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in unexpected places. And it began in 1861. It reached a fever pitch in 63, but it continued throughout the war. In 1864, the year of his reelection, he closed down the New York World and the New York Journal of Commerce, two Democratic newspapers in Manhattan, for printing a false presidential proclamation of seemingly no consequence, by the way. But he didn't like it because it suggested there was a leak in the White House. So there's never been a crackdown like this. And Lincoln's justification was, I'm saving the Constitution. So if I have to violate little parts of it, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press, the Constitution says the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended during a rebellion. And there was a lot of pushback. But the press had to be careful about pushing back too much, because then they would go to jail. So I would say there were about 175 shutdowns of newspapers throughout the country in the 4 years of the Civil War. That's a lot.
That's a lot. That's out of how many, do you suppose?
5,000.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And did this have a tremendous cooling effect on them? Or did they still resist?
The one thing Lincoln objected to principally were newspapers that said that soldiers should not volunteer. That was what instigated the first crackdown. That, to Lincoln, was not dissent, it was treason. And he was desperate after the Battle of Bull Run, because 75,000 people had volunteered 3 months earlier for 3 months. And after the loss in Virginia, morale was terrible, and Lincoln was afraid that he couldn't replenish the army and pursue the preservation of the Union. So that was the original crackdown. But there was also, crackdown against, Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware. If your newspaper said we really should consider seceding from the Union in the border states, then Lincoln closed the army. Lincoln kept his hands off, except the New York World and New York Journal. But the Army or the State Department or the Post Office Department would crack down on newspapers. Either seize the printing press, throw out the type. When I tell this to kids, they say, "What's type?" Hot type. They set in racks, sticks they called them. So that was the apogee of it. And Lincoln said, doing this is like an emetic. People prescribe emetics when there's an upset stomach. Nobody likes taking emetics. So when the war is over, nobody will want to administer emetics. And just generally, he was right.
Yeah, you think it worked?
I think he overdid it, because we know he won the war. We know that he issued the Emancipation. We know that 175,000 African Americans volunteered or were drafted and fought for their own freedom, giving the North a huge advantage, depriving the South of labor. But Lincoln didn't know what was going to work out. So he was desperately looking for every advantage at that point.
I think that one of the challenges of us trying to understand a particular period, say this, and how it affected, is just what you're saying.
We know the outcome.
We know, but they didn't know.
They didn't know.
And we now can look at our own situation and we don't know. So trying to take that kind of mindset
Exactly.
is very helpful, I think. Now, every president has to have some mechanism to reach the people. And certainly the press played that role. But I think Lincoln developed another mechanism for reaching the people using a new technology.
Well, he used two things, a new technology and a new kind of precedent. The technology was the telegraph, which sped news to people. And this is also the era of the steam-powered press. So weeklies and biweeklies are now dailies. The New York Herald would print 3 editions a day and hundreds of thousands of copies. But by the end of the Civil War, Lincoln was sending dispatches from the front in Virginia, and he was kind of the war correspondent in chief. The press would just publish his letters to the War Department verbatim. But the other thing he did is when he was writing letters to critics on policy, on freedom of the press, on whether or not to issue the Emancipation, on whether or not to enlist African Americans for the Army, he developed a technique of not just sending the letter to one individual, but also releasing it to the newspapers. We call them public letters. So famous letter to Horace Greeley on, my paramount object is to save the Union. If I could do so by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could do it by freeing none of the slaves, I would do it. And this is after he'd written the proclamation. So it's kind of disingenuous, but a brilliant public relations technique. He also used the AP, as no president had used. It was just kind of a new organization. He would call in Associated Press reporters, give them a story, and they would run off and distribute it to thousands of papers.
What about getting in front of the people in speeches and so on?
Lincoln became aware during the Lincoln-Douglas debates that as many thousands of people as attended these events, many times that number would read the speeches as they were published in the newspapers. So he got into the idea of hiring partisan stenographers to cover the debates, as did Stephen Douglas. So different versions, friendly, the Republican papers made Lincoln sound like Cicero and Douglas sound like a lunatic. And the Democratic papers made Lincoln sound like an idiot and Douglas
I don't think that's changed, has it?
We have live recordings now, and so it's a little harder to change the transcripts. But yeah, I think Lincoln became more aware of eyewitnesses and less aware of ear witnesses as the years went on.
Mm-hmm. So now let's move forward to President I know something about, Theodore Roosevelt, and the advent of the yellow press and all that. How did he approach it?
I mean, it is amazing how presidents have been, we have chosen exactly the right person for a particular era, whether it's the crises that they felt or the newspaper technology that they encountered. Roosevelt becomes president by accident in the era of the headline press. The partisan press is dwindling. Adolph Ox has purchased the New York Times in the 1890s and said, we don't want to be a Republican paper anymore. We want to be all the news that's fit to print. And meanwhile, Pulitzer and the others are headline blaring. So it used to be a press that was focused on editorials. Now it's a press that's focused on page one news. And who is better made to be in page one than Theodore Roosevelt? And if he wasn't on page one, he was a very unhappy man from everything I've studied. He wanted to be not just the bride at every wedding, but the headline in every newspaper. They'd leave that out of that wonderful litany. He was also the best man at Franklin and Eleanor's wedding. Mm-hmm. As Tweed said, I work at the other Roosevelt house. Sometimes when I'm in Manhattan, I call this the other Roosevelt house, but Franklin and Eleanor's home on 65th Street. And Franklin and Eleanor could only get married on Columbus Day, right? Because that was the day that President Roosevelt was going to be the Grand Marshal of the parade. So that was, these were going to do two events in one day, right near each other on Fifth
Both
Avenue.
headlines.
Both headlines.
Yeah.
Well, the wedding less so.
He gave her away, yes.
He did. Theodore also was well, he was a writer. He wrote, as you said, magazine articles of his own. So he created the press. He was made for cartoons, as you and I have discussed, in the era when cartoons became prevalent. No one since Lincoln was a more natural fit for cartoons. Lincoln because of the beard and the height, and Roosevelt because of the teeth and the pince-nez and all of the look. It was the mustache. He was perfect for parody, and whether it's a teddy bear or a cartoon. But we should also remember that Theodore Roosevelt was a champion of long form journalism. He encouraged Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens to champion his causes in long form influential journalism that produced amazing reform legislation.
And yet he called them muckrakers too.
He called them muckrakers, and when he was done with them, he denounced them. He was also the first president to hold what evolved into press conferences, actually more like, much as I fear saying it, much more like the Donald Trump model, not of having formal news conferences, but of having the press in while, in his case, while he was being shaved every day. It was called the barber's hour. They would come in to the office near the new Oval Office. The barber would be shaving TR, and he would answer questions off the record, unless you asked for it to be on the record, then it could be on the record. And the press, was a little annoyed at him because they had to ask permission to use the quotes. And he got mad at them and put them in purgatory if they wrote something he didn't like. So the press responded by, when the barber was shaving his neck, that's when someone would ask the most disobliging question. Because he used to jump up with a cape on and let's see if we can draw blood.
Which I think he did once.
A few times, yeah.
Yeah.
But just
the poor barber.
Yes, he was very put upon because he was worried. But this is the first time the press is getting everyday exposure to a president of the United States, and one with a personality big enough to provide information personality and all of that.
Yeah, he created the press room idea, I believe.
He did. Oh, yes, he opened the first press room.
Mhm.
Right. He did.
Quite a world. I'm glad you mentioned cartoonist. I remember once Conan O'Brien came to one of my events, and he gave a significant speech at it, and his subject was TR, the original emoji. And I think he's right too. It was a very interesting talk.
I might suggest that Lincoln was the original emoji, but
Yeah,
and Conan is a huge Lincoln fan.
And TR too.
And TR, but why Lincoln? There's always a reason. If someone is 6'7", they're usually either ball players or Lincoln fans, or both. So he's a passionate Lincoln reader.
I'm told he registers in hotels as Theodore Roosevelt.
Okay, if he's trying to avoid attention, that's not a very smart thing to do. But
anyway, all right, let's move on to an entirely different kind of president, Wilson.
Someone said going from the Roosevelt era to the Wilson era, a journalist wrote, I think he said was like going from a furnace to a convent. Such action and activity when TR was there, and Wilson, although he had the first formal press conferences, they were extremely rigid affairs. He stood up, he read the questions, they had to be submitted in advance. He got very angry if they were disobliging questions, and the press just did not like Wilson. It wasn't about racism, it wasn't about internationalism, it was about his rigidity with them. He regarded them as the enemy and didn't see the opportunity. And for a writer and historian like Roosevelt, Wilson was a writer and historian, he just didn't get it. And he squandered the opportunity to give them access, information, and a little bit of charm. You know, I read people who say, you know, people don't understand Wilson's charm. I don't understand his charm because he didn't share it.
Yeah. And sometimes his relationship, not only testy, but devolved into violent.
Absolutely.
That story, I love.
There are two. Someone once wrote that his daughter rode a bicycle, which apparently was akin to, I don't know, what terrible thing a woman could do in 1920, probably anything. So he threatened to punch that reporter in the nose. When he was, this is before he became president, he was president-elect. When he was president, a reporter dared to speculate on on a member of his cabinet, and Wilson actually chased him round and round his desk. This is a president of the United States. I mean, Trump might do that if he could run.
Yeah,
but you know,
surprised Wilson could run.
I'm surprised. Well, yeah. And he kept saying, "Are you ever going to do that again? Are you ever going to?" Finally, the reporter said, "No, I promise. Stop."
I would have loved to have seen that.
I know it's crazy, and he engendered a great deal of hostility, especially when he was thinking about it, this irrational comeback bid after he was sick. There was no sympathy for it.
What about the war and his handling of it?
Oh, well, he set a precedent that his associate Franklin Roosevelt later followed. He established a committee for public information and appointed a brilliant guy named George Creel to run it. And they did two things. They censored news on shipping, on anything that might be used by the enemy. And of course, again, foreign enemy and World War, no one knew what the outcome would be. But he also, Creel organized a gigantic propaganda effort to support the war. Posters, that's why all these great illustrators like Limedecker did posters. Posters, speeches, people went to county fairs with leaflets around the world, not just around the country, to keep morale up in a dark couple of years. My favorite story, which I knew nothing about, is that they developed a cadre of specialists who gave 70-second speeches. Why? Because apparently that's the time it took to change reels at the silent movies. So for entertainment, they would have propagandists come up and say, buy bonds, support the war, our doughboys are doing great, send a salami to your boy in the army. Oh, that's World War II. Whatever they said. And so the propaganda effort was unique. And again, we will get to it, but it was replicated in World War II.
Right, and based on technology. At the beginning, even though he was pretty much a failure with the press as dealing with these sorts of things worked.
He did. And, you know, he famously said when he screened Birth of a Nation at the White House, he said, "This is history by lightning." So he was the first to understand film. And actually, there are some filmed, I wouldn't call them commercials, as we know political commercials, but they come close to it. He made a few newsreels, silent newsreels.
And that went in Saturday afternoon all around the country.
Yeah.
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 Like movie tone.
His radio voice was not great. I heard a recording with the League of Nations. It's very surprising. It's gravelly.
Well, talking about radio, let's come to FDR.
Again, the man and the moment met. That beautiful voice was really made for radio. And the press adored him. I mean, it's interesting. He had a lot of press friends. He courted them, and they decided, without any regulation until the war, that they were not going to cover his disability. They were not going to show photographs of his braces. There are stories of White House press conferences at which a new reporter ordered by the Republican Chicago Tribune to get a picture of him in his wheelchair, that another photographer would hit him just at the moment he was taking the picture, and the camera fell in the White House in the Oval Office and was shattered. And that's how the new photographer learned the lesson. But you know, Roosevelt took them to picnics at Hyde Park. He said, joked with him, "I'm not using the tennis courts today. Any journalist who wants to use the tennis courts, he invited them to swim with him in the White House pool, where they observed the impact that polio had had on his withered legs. He invited them to White House dinners. They didn't always go because the food was so notoriously bad, but he made drinks for them. And then he went over their head, as you said, and gave 36 fireside chats, which was the way to circumvent the press. And of course, that was just the beginning. You know, I'm very glad I talked to my mother about FDR. She was a huge FDR admirer, and she was born in 1916. So the two questions I got to ask her, she was almost 100 when she died, but the two questions I got to ask her were, did you know about Roosevelt's disability? And she said, everyone knew about Roosevelt's disability because we all collected money for the March of Dimes. But we knew that he had recovered his ability to walk. So that was the little misinformation. And the other thing is, how many fireside chats did you think there were? Well, he was there for 12 years, so 500? No, 36. But that's because he was always on the radio. So.
And he got to pretty much everybody's radio, everywhere.
There's a great story that I tell in the book. It's not great because I tell it. It's great because Saul Bellow told it. Saul Bellow is who worked for the federal government. You know, he was one of those writers who was supported by the WPA. He's driving someplace in Chicago in the middle of summer. It's hot and the traffic is stopped, sort of like yesterday around here. And he's listening to a fireside chat and he wants to hear it, but he can't stand the heat in the cab. So he says, I'm paying off and walking the rest of the way. And he gets out and walks about a mile and never misses a word of the fireside chat because every taxi and every car has it on. Mm-hmm. And I think Philip Roth told a similar story about growing up in Newark and going from stoop to stoop with playing handball and hearing the fireside chats without interruption. So yeah, everywhere.
And he really knew how to do that. Now the war comes along and it's a different story.
Suddenly, oh, by the way, Roosevelt had 996 news conferences, twice a week, almost everywhere he was. Warm Springs, Casablanca. He screwed the press the day of the North Atlantic Charter, and some of them never forgave him because he had a double on his yacht pretending to be fishing. And Fowler was actually left on board as a decoy. And he took a destroyer up to Canada to meet Churchill. And Churchill brought the entire British press corps with him. So they were very angry for a long time. So during World War II, he continues with press conferences, but suddenly there's much more information that can't be shared. And like Woodrow Wilson, for whom he worked, you know, he admired both his cousin and his boss. He admired both Teddy and Woodrow. He creates a modern propaganda unit, but instead of having people go to county fairs, he hires John Ford and John Huston and other great directors to make films about the war effort. And they create brilliant films that win Oscars. Frank Capra was in the group, and I'm blanking on the one who did, George Stevens was the other big one. And and also there was obviously information that was thereafter not shared.
So would we know the names of any of these movies they made, or are they all?
Why We Fought is the most famous one.
Mm-hmm.
And they got great footage because they were great, you know, cinematographer, director. They had cinematographers with them. But a lot of the World War II films of the late 40s and 50s included their footage. You know, these color shots of jets pirouetting around the skies in the Atlantic and Pacific are real directors. It's not just somebody with a 16mm Kodak.
And of course, Hitler was doing the same thing. Would you say our propaganda was up to that, or?
I would say that the Nazi propaganda before the war with Leni Riefenstahl, the unrepentant woman who lived to be about, I'm speaking of long life, she lived to about 105.
Really?
Yeah. And was never completely sanitized, whatever the word is, denazified. You know, she made Triumph of the Will, It's just dazzling movie about the Olympics and which is scary in its celebration of Aryan virtue, when she was a genius.
Oh, they use that film in film schools
Yeah,
everywhere.
still, right.
Still, yeah.
And, she influenced the film noir movement and all, Orson Welles was influenced by the way she did camera angles from the bottom. But she was brilliant, yeah. She was evil, but she was brilliant.
Let's go on to JFK.
Made for television, right? Again, the man in the hour. He had the voice, he had the looks, and his press conferences were events. I remember I went to school middle school and high school in Little Neck, which is not too far from here. And I used to come home right after school on the day that he was doing press conferences. It was always at 4 o'clock. And I wanted to see them. They were entertaining. They were fascinating. That's when I developed my fascination in the American presidency, was because of Kennedy. And they did not hold them in the White House. The first press conferences not in the White House. Why? Because they wanted a dark blue background. They wanted an elevated stage. And they went to the State Department, which was kind of newly built. And the brilliant Pierre Salinger created this look. And I know you sometimes have the presidential rostrum on this stage, right? With the seal. Nobody ever used the seal of the presidency until Pierre Salinger said, why don't we put the seal? It'll look very good. And that nothing changed after that first press conference, except that in the first press conference, Pierre Salinger sat on stage and he was kind of sloppy looking. And that was it. He was off after that. But they were events. And he handled it. He used to call on when things got dull. There was one woman, I'm blanking on her name, but FDR had made terrible fun of her during his press conferences. That's how old she's been. She was a veteran. And he teased her mercilessly because, men teased women in those days. And she was a pathfinder. She was the only one of 2 women in the Roosevelt press corps. When things got dull, he would call on her. And she would always ask a wacky question. She wore a hat. I don't know if anybody remembers her.
Helen Thomas.
Oh, no.
Different hat.
May something. Her first name was May. And she would always ask something totally irrelevant. And he would simply look at her and say, yes, we'll try to do that. And people would just crack up. And it would enliven the session. It was a little mean, but she became very famous as a result of his kind of selfish attention. Helen Thomas was,
yeah, let's talk about Helen Thomas.
She was eventually the dean of the press corps. She sat right where you're sitting.
Right there.
That was her seat. Nobody
Maybe
dared.
that one.
But I think, who is the president? One president finally said, you're sitting back there. She outlived her welcome. And one day there was a bring your kids to work day for the White House. And a student went up to Helen Thomas and said, why are you so unfair to Israel? No one knew that. I mean, I didn't know that Helen Thomas, I didn't know that she was Lebanese. I mean, she went into a rant about Israel, and that was the end of her career. UPI dropped her. She started her own news service called the Helen Thomas News Service, but she lost the senior. She asked the first question in every news conference.
Everything she asked the first question.
She did not have to be recognized. But everything comes to an end, and she became an opinion person before it became fashionable to be an opinion person.
She was quite a character.
She was a character. I met her a couple of times. She was formidable.
Let's go on to Johnson. Now, here we go. A real roller coaster ride.
Johnson wanted to be as popular with Kennedy. And I should have said, like Roosevelt, Kennedy was shielded. His peccadillos were not reported. His health was not reported. That was a big deal because Kennedy did not have good health. But Kennedy was a journalist. He had covered England after the war. He'd covered Churchill's election defeat. He had written books. They loved him. Ben Bradley was a buddy of his, and he ran the Washington Post, a good friend to have. So and Kennedy also believed that the press should be quiet, particularly after the Bay of Pigs. But they were basically on his side. They didn't like
They
Nixon.
certainly did in the missile crisis too.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Uh,
But Johnson wanted to be loved, and he was kind of hard to love. Now, he was a media executive also. He owned, through Lady Bird, he owned a lot of radio stations. But he did not like, Kennedy didn't like criticism. He used to go around the outer office and cancel subscriptions. I'm not taking the Herald Tribune anymore. I don't want to see it in this office. Because they were a Republican paper owned by John Whitman.
back.
They creep back because Jackie liked the fashion section. So then he would come back, what is this doing here? I told you. And they said, oh, sorry, Mr. President. They would never throw Jackie under the bus. But Johnson was titanic in his criticisms. And during the darkest days of Vietnam, he would call newspaper desks and editors and TV stations. He particularly hated a man I interviewed for the book who's still around, Marvin Kalb. I don't know if you remember.
I remember.
Two brothers, Marvin Kalb and Bernard Kalb. Johnson hated them. Nixon hated them more. Nixon added a little bit of anti-Semitic salts to his criticism when he would call the desks. But he thought they were traitors. We hear that again. If a newspaper if a journalist criticizes some aspect of foreign policy, they often skirt on the edge of being accused of treason.
It's still happening, of course.
It's still happening.
So, Clinton.
I find Clinton very likable, so I don't understand why so many journalists hated him from the get-go. Well, they hated the 60 Minutes event. I talked to a lot of journalists, because now I can talk to people who covered the presidents who are still alive. And remember the famous 60 Minutes thing where Clinton and Hillary talked about the solidity of their marriage. I'm no Tammy Wynette, whatever. They just thought that was a fraud. And they were very angry at him, and they weren't after him. They were after him in ways that presidents had never been pursued before. And then of all things, we had a press secretary named D.D. Myers. I don't know D.D. Myers, but maybe she wasn't up to the task of containing their anger or jealousy, whatever it was. The first day of Clinton's presidency, they boarded up the door that led to the press room that Theodore Roosevelt had created. Now, Johnson had used it as the bottom area was a pool at that point, and Nixon covered up the pool. Johnson used to swim with the reporters. Not all the reporters liked it because that included a lot of scotch and a lot of nude swimming. And Johnson used to yell to the reporters, don't you want to see your president naked? And they would say, no, not really. Well, come on in then. So it was a little...
Yeah, and he did worse than that.
He did worse than that, yeah. So Clinton closed, you can still have your press room, but you can't come right up to the press office and into the West Wing. Well, that was also a big, big PR mistake. And what happened next? Travelgate. Yeah. Not the worst thing that ever happened in the world. I don't even remember what it was about, a travel agent. But they made a huge thing about it. And that's when the word gate first began to be affixed to every kind of presidential scandal, picking up on Watergate. So the press just never quite cottoned to Bill Clinton. And he won the battle, because when they came after his hide in the Lewinsky scandal, he did enough television appearances to win the people back. And his poll numbers were never higher than they were after he refused to resign.
Yeah, nobody thought he was going to survive that.
I didn't.
Yeah.
By the way, he's the only president that spoke to me for this book. And when it came out, he called up and said, I like the book a lot, but I got to tell you this story about it. Then he told me this unbelievable story. And I said, Mr. President, I wish you had told me that before I finished the book. And he said, no, I knew I wasn't going to do that. So I don't even remember what it was, but it was pretty...
Oh, too bad.
Yeah, I know. I don't remember.
Well, we come to Obama, which really surprises me.
It surprised me too.
Yeah.
The press did not like Barack Obama. Why? Because he did not respond to them. He did not spend time with them. He was the first president whose press secretary said, what is the president, the question was, what is the president's opinion on this? And the press secretary said, please refer to the website. Because he had installed a presidential website and he didn't think he had to answer questions. And he also did more surveillance on reporters than any president in American history, and denied more freedom of information requests than any administration in history. So there was a lot of resentment against him. My friend Jonathan Alter, who has written about Franklin Roosevelt and other things, said, we were lucky to see him on a reporter's birthday when he would come to the press room with a cupcake and a candle. You know, presidents who can speak beyond the press are often resented, right? Because they have the power to reach people without the aid of the press. And, you know, we're in a new era with Obama. The website is the precursor of something extraordinary, which is a whole communications revolution that changed everything.
You mentioned leaks earlier. Not who you said started was Lincoln, I guess. But it's a perennial problem, and
it probably insoluble, right? I mean, there will, as long as there is a journalist who will print a story and cause a sensation, there will be a leak. People have tried everything. There are presidents who've had lie detector sets, you know, let's give them sodium pentothal, whatever we need. Every president rails against leaks.
so there is no solution.
No, the solution is, you know, well, I think there are fewer leaks in the second Trump administration than in any recent administration. There were lots of leaks in the first Trump administration, and he went nuts about it. But this one is pretty tightly bottled up. They have a very efficient chief of staff, and she is pretty strong as an executive in the West Wing.
On the other
Susie
side
Wiles,
of that argument, leaks often come from the administration.
Well, they come from the administration when they're trying to kill each other off. Yeah. So, yeah, in the first administration, Stephen Miller would leak about Lewandowski, and they would leak about each other. But I'm amazed that it's bottled up so much now. Well, that's because the president is the biggest leaker of them all, President Trump. He's online every night with 7 tweets about things that no one knows about, including half of his own administration. So he's the one who
firing people right and left.
Right. Well, he wants to be the person sending out the news, and he, of course, is going to go down in history as one of the great communicator presidents in American history. Whatever you think of Trump, he knows how to do it, right? And in the first term, as I write in the book, he would do a tweet at 6 in the morning, and CNN and Fox and the station formerly known as MSNBC would spend the whole day having panels to discuss the tweet. Now there are so many tweets that it's like, it's beyond he doesn't need them to analyze it because he's on Truth Social, he's on X. And in this new world, fewer and fewer people are watching CNN, MSN, or Fox. They're getting their information from their handheld devices, and they don't need to hear any discussion. And that's why this relationship between the president and the press is going to be in totally uncharted territory henceforth.
And future presidents?
I don't know, they'll speak into their spectacles or their tie. I don't know what the next, I mean, could we have imagined where we are technologically 5 years ago? Could we have imagined this? My biggest worry is not about the presidents, it's about the kids and how they're relating to each other and how those in isolation are relating to no one and turning to fringe movements and violence by what's on the web. And then you bring in the AI factor, which is unknowable at this point. And it's kind of a scary brew for the future. So in my historian role, I get to look back, but I can't, I'm not that great at looking ahead.
Yeah, well, I think none of us are.
Yeah.
Well, let's give a chance for people to ask questions. So, sir.
It was 8 or 5 years ago that Lincoln was sworn in as president, and really illuminate that time period. Originally, I thought Raven Massey might have been Lincoln, but now I know that it's actually a colorized version. we see a lot of human nature at play throughout history. We see the pandering to different groups. We see Lincoln owning half of that German newspaper. I read both of your books, not all 40, but I read the one on immigration and also on the media. And I'm wondering, based on the idea of the Civil War, which obviously was fought for a lot of reasons, morally, obviously slavery was wrong, but it was an economic system, because Eli Whitney, created the cotton gin in 1794, made cotton very valuable, so now you needed a whole lifestyle. So public opinion and the lifestyle of people at any particular point in time could basically set up how people are going to deal with the world around them. Now, we can look at the historical record, which, once again, I really appreciate what you brought up. It makes you look at history and say, well, how's it pertinent to today? So my question is this: Abraham Lincoln went through the Civil War. We had an economic war. We had the North versus the South. My question is this: how do you think today of the political situation? Would you be thinking along the lines of this is almost the second Civil War, although not kinetic? Or would you say, hey, it's business as usual? The newspapers always did it. So how do you do it?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked me that after I just said that I don't do the future, but that's okay. I try not to do the. Yeah, it's, my opinion is worth no more than anybody else's on what he would think, I think. But I would think he'd tend more to think that it's business as usual in terms of partisanship. Lincoln was a creature of a very partisan world and a very politicized world. The difference was that there was 80% turnout in elections in the 1860s. I mean, it was all men, it was all white people, but it was 80%. It's not 80% of white men today. It's like 40% of white men vote today. And 45% of the rest of the world votes today. But the fighting and the argumentation and the anger, that was all part of his culture. And do I think he'd think this is as bad as the run-up to the American Civil War? No, I don't think he would. Sporadic episodes of violence were also part of the American culture in the 1840s and 50s, and
Even on the Senate floor,
1856. Yeah, Preston Brooks beat Charles Sumner almost to death
killed him.
with a gutta percha cane, for which he was not only not charged with a crime, but was rewarded with something like 100 gifts of replacement canes to replace the one he broke on Sumner's skull.
yeah, I mean, on the subject of we don't know the future, but you could certainly see that just before the Civil War was a whole element above us.
I don't think people should think that what is going on now is a normal that we should embrace for future generations. I think we should push back against what we find unpleasant and maybe add a little more of decorum to politics, less hysteria. But again, it's also the media culture that invites this kind of hysterical response because it gets a lot of play. Not only on the television news for us to watch, but the retweeting business, which is huge.
Huge. Yeah, I mean, those days they tended to be just a fewer papers, or at least major ones.
They had to be.
We can't do everything, but go ahead.
Well, Nixon famously said after losing his comeback bid for governor, you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. He believed he didn't get enough credit for his congressional and Senate career as an anti-communist. He believed the press turned against him because they were all communists. He hated them in 1960. He realized he was not a television personality because his makeup dripped in the debates. And I learned in the book that Kennedy was not planning to. There was no television makeup in those days. That his press aide went out and got, and I have it in the book, Max Factor number something, and so you should put this on. And he looked great. Remember, the radio audience who was surveyed after the first debate thought that Nixon won the debate, and the television audience overwhelmingly thought that Kennedy won the debate. And his antipathy grew But Nixon is still the only president who is actually taken down by the media. And one of the things that has made the culture, the press culture with presidents so furious now is that every journalist that I've met in the last 50 years wants to be Carl Bernstein or Bob Woodward. That's the dream, right? But I think it was one moment in time.
Yeah.
And look, Jimmy Carter was, speaking of someone we didn't speak about, was not popular with the press either. Because it's so interesting. It just takes a little bit of friendliness. I've dealt with journalists for half a century. If you're constantly hostile to them, they're going to find an opportunity over the years. They're going to find at least one opportunity to screw you. And I cleaned that statement up. When professionals talk about it, they don't use that word.
Let's on that note.
I think this lady had one question. One of the greatest, yeah.
Is it also the accuracy of the information that he's communicating? I mean,
Very good question. No, right. And there have been many presidents of both parties who have dissembled in their communication. He's not the first. He does it more often than others. So, yes, it's not just out there, which he is. It's using using new technologies, which he has been very skilled at. And yes, there's a factor of accuracy, which you have to count on the other side. And I will give you, if I may, just a quick example. C-SPAN does a survey of presidential historians every time there's a change in administration. So when Biden came to office, they did a survey that included every president up to Trump 1. And the joke among historians was that Trump was going to be last. But the C-SPAN survey is very specific. They ask relations with Congress, relations with foreign leaders. And one of the criteria is communications. And many of us who were surveyed, even if there were those who gave Trump zeros in other areas, gave him 8s and 9s in communications. The only points he lost were for truth or absence of truth from time to time. So he wasn't listed as the worst president. He came out ahead of Andrew Johnson and Warren Harding. Not a great place to be. I don't know what, it's very interesting. C-SPAN did not do the survey when Biden left because they argued it wasn't a new administration. It was the same administration. I think they didn't want to have a survey that came out that showed him last. But I would still give him high marks for communication. Take a few points off for accuracy.
I think the Democrats are going to have to learn how, or whoever, anybody who's playing this game is going to have to learn how to do it.
And I don't know anyone who's out there from either party looking ahead, if we make it to 28? I haven't even had the midterms yet. I don't know anyone who is as masterful at that as Donald Trump.
All right. Well, thank you. That's great to have you here.
Thank you, Tweed.
And hopefully there'll be a new book and you'll pull even further ahead than you are.
Thanks for everything.
So our next talk is on September 17th, where I'll be bringing up a presidential descendant, Sarah Barry, who will talk about her ancestor, who's Garfield, James A. Garfield. He's pretty much a forgotten president. I mean, I suspect there are very few people in this world that can tell you anything about Garfield. And yet I've already started looking into, he's very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was.
I would ask you what you thought about it, because it comes off very, very sympathetically in that
I thought it was
tragedy.
I thought it was a great series. That very realistic scenes of the streets of New York. And
But is it realistic?
he was very popular.
Very,
Very popular.
very popular. You know, it's interesting that Edmund Morris wrote a 3-volume book. It's sort of the great book on TR. His life. I remember talking to him, and he said something to the effect, he was rather full of himself, something to the effect that nobody ever needs to write another biography of TR. But it's so interesting that each generation, because of the change environments, need a new biography, or forgotten presidents start having them.
Yeah.
And we're having them now.
There's a new book coming out that is going to have a lot of TR in it. My friend Walter Starr has written a 700-page biography of William Howard Taft.
Oh, wow.
So 100 pages are TR. So
Wow.
all of you aficionados should watch it. I haven't read it yet, but I wonder what he's going to do with 1912.
It'd be interesting. Well,
Yeah.
I'll come back on the 17th of September. And thank you.
Thanks.